What if the smartest people in the world have already given up on saving it? Somewhere beyond the beaches of Kauai, past the rows of sugarcane and the whispering palms, a vast estate unfurls like a secret. It is not merely a vacation home or a remote getaway. It is a fortress, invisible to satellites, cloaked in NDAs, protected by blast doors and private armies, and it belongs to Mark Zuckerberg. This story does not begin with panic, but with foresight. It doesn't start in a boardroom or a battlefield, but in the subtle corridors of influence, inside tech empires where algorithms trace the tremors of society before the rest of us feel them. What if those who built the platform shaping modern civilization now fear what they've unleashed? In the past decade, the world's 10 most influential tech billionaires, from Musk and Bezos to Zuckerberg and Gates, have quietly embarked on the same strange mission: survival. Not metaphorically. Not in the PR language of resilience or sustainability. No, literally. They are building bunkers, buying islands, colonizing planets, hoarding seeds, and rehearsing for collapse. These are not scattered eccentricities. They are patterns, coordinated, well-funded, and deeply secretive. The preparations span continents and disciplines: orbital habitats, underground cities, self-sustaining farms, encrypted communication systems, private militaries. These billionaires aren't just hedging bets. They're acting like people who know what's coming. But what do they know? Each chapter in this unfolding story peers behind the curtain of power, tracing the construction of modern-day arcs for the digital elite. Their plans reflect a single, unspoken assumption: that civilization, as we know it, may not survive this century, and that those with the means should prepare not to fix it, but to escape it. Yet woven into this narrative of dread is another thread, more delicate, more human. A question that shadows every survival bunker and Mars capsule. Is escape a solution or an abdication? What does it say about our future that those with the most power to shape it are building lifeboats instead of bridges? This is not a doomsday tale. It is a human story about knowledge, fear, responsibility, and the quiet reckoning of those who helped build the 21st century. It is about what happens when the people who know the most about the future stop believing in the present. We begin in Hawaii, where one of the richest men alive built a digital empire that rewired how we communicate, then used its spoils to build a shelter beneath the earth, sealed from the world he helped change. Because the end of the world doesn't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it begins with silence and a door that locks from the inside. It started with a fence, then a gate, then men in black shirts patrolling the edge of a once quiet valley on the Hawaiian island of Kauai. Locals whispered about it: the strange deliveries, the foreign contractors, the constant hum of construction. But no one really knew what was happening behind the guarded perimeters of Mark Zuckerberg's 1,400-acre compound, until a few brave workers spoke off the record about what lay beneath the surface. 5,000 square feet of reinforced concrete buried beneath red volcanic soil. Walls layered with military-grade steel and radiation shielding. Air filtration systems, power generators, and blast-proof doors designed not just to withstand disaster, but to survive years of isolation. Zuckerberg wasn't building a retreat. He was building a sanctuary for the collapse. And yet the bunker was just one piece. Above ground, the land was transformed into a living machine: orchards, aquaculture systems, hydroponic farms, livestock enclosures, each engineered to feed a small community without ever relying on the outside world. Seed banks ensured crop regeneration. Water treatment plants could purify both groundwater and seawater. Solar arrays and geothermal systems produced round-the-clock electricity. Security was everywhere: motion sensors, thermal imaging, restricted airspace. A private force equipped not like estate guards, but like paramilitary units. This was not luxury, this was survival. Why? Because Zuckerberg, more than almost anyone, has seen what the digital world can do to the real one. He has watched, from the inside, as misinformation splintered communities, radicalized movements, and destabilized governments. Through the lens of social media, he has witnessed civilization fraying faster than anyone dared admit. And then 2020 happened. The pandemic, the riots, the panic buying, the algorithms lit up like fire alarms. According to leaked building permits, it was in that year that construction on his underground facility accelerated dramatically. New housing, medical clinics, educational structures. Communication systems severed from public infrastructure. This wasn't just a panic room. It was a hidden society, complete with emergency surgery facilities, digital archives, and escape routes via air and sea. The location, remote, fertile, and defensible, had been chosen with surgical precision. Kauai was far from mainland unrest, yet close enough to stage an exit. One day it could become a cradle for a new beginning, or a last stand. And yet the man at its center speaks only of sustainability and Hawaiian heritage when asked. The contrast is stark. Public statements about connecting with the land and private actions that reveal deep distrust in the systems that support it. What does it mean when someone who helped connect the world now prepares to disconnect from it entirely? Perhaps Zuckerberg's compound is not a testament to paranoia, but to proximity, to a front-row seat at the unraveling. To see the code fracture, the feedback loops spiral, the threads of truth pulled loose until the whole weave of society seems ready to tear. In this light, the bunker is not madness. It is logic, chilling, unspoken, and perhaps justified. But one question echoes through those tunnels beneath Kauai louder than any generator. If those who understand the fragility of civilization the most are preparing to live without it, who will be left to save it? High above the Texas plains, where the sun burns the horizon into a haze, rockets rise with silent urgency. They're not just symbols of ambition, they're lifeboats. And Elon Musk is their architect. At first glance, SpaceX looks like a triumph of exploration, a bold dream of turning Mars into humanity's next chapter. But inside the glass walls of its headquarters, a different conversation plays out. Not about adventure, about escape. Musk's vision isn't just scientific, it's existential. His private remarks, leaked from investor meetings and internal memos, tell a different story than the one staged for press releases. Civilization insurance, he calls it, a backup for humanity. But backup implies something's about to fail, and he seems to believe that moment is near. Why else rush? Why else fund a crash program with impossible deadlines, sleepless engineers, and life support systems designed not for comfort, but survival? The Starship, SpaceX's crown jewel, is built less like a vehicle of discovery and more like an ark. Its design prioritizes maximum passenger capacity over amenities. No plush interiors or sweeping views. Just the bare essentials: oxygen, radiation shielding, food rations, and recycled water. A vessel to evacuate, not explore. Internal documents describe emergency scenarios, how to load, launch, and deliver critical personnel, quickly, quietly, and without reliance on earthbound systems. The payload? Not cargo. People. The VIPs of the 21st century. The builders of tomorrow's colony. But even as he plans for Mars, Musk fortifies Earth. His other ventures mirror his celestial playbook. Tesla develops off-grid power solutions. The Boring Company drills underground transport systems that double as bunkers. Neuralink creates interfaces that could operate technology even if your hands are injured or the world goes dark. Each piece fits into a puzzle few have been allowed to see in full. It's not hard to imagine a future in which Earth becomes a shell of itself, too hot, too unstable, too chaotic. In that world, the starship doesn't launch out of hope. It launches out of necessity. And those left behind will watch its fire trail disappear into the atmosphere, knowing the gate has closed. Musk has always warned about the fragility of our civilization. But now, with every new test flight, every accelerated timeline, every whispered protocol, he seems less focused on warning and more focused on leaving. And still, a question hovers over the launch pad like heat off steel. If Mars is the answer, what was the question? Is it survival or surrender? Because there's something haunting about a man who's seen the future through the lens of artificial intelligence, climate models, and social unrest, and decided the only solution is to build a door in the sky. Maybe Musk's dream isn't utopian. Maybe it's an elegy, a final salute to a world we couldn't hold together. And as the countdown begins, and the engines roar to life, one can't help but wonder, when the brightest minds decide their best hope is elsewhere, what happens to the rest of us, still standing on the launch pad, watching the sky? The South Island of New Zealand is a place of quiet majesty, snow-capped mountains, rolling meadows, and fjords that shimmer like secrets. For most, it's a haven of peace. For Peter Thiel, it is a vault. The PayPal co-founder and early Facebook investor didn't just buy land here. He bought sanctuary, discreetly, strategically. Acres upon acres of untouched wilderness, remote yet reachable. And then, beneath that wilderness, he began to build. Local contractors, sworn to silence, hint at what lies below. 6 levels of reinforced subterranean infrastructure. Steel-reinforced bunkers, medical clinics, communication hubs sealed off from the grid, and living quarters, not Spartan shelters, but residences designed for the long haul. Above ground, it's a working estate, sustainable farms, workshops, and supply depots. A self-contained economy, a closed-loop world. And it's not just for him. Thiel's survival blueprint includes logistics networks, planes in multiple countries, pre-staged fuel caches, emergency shipping routes, all designed to ensure that in a crisis he can reach New Zealand in hours, not days. Once there, he won't be alone. Reports suggest he's coordinated with a small circle of elite tech allies. Their combined properties form a quiet constellation of off-grid strongholds stretching across the Pacific. This isn't panic. It's precision. And like the others, the timing matters. Thiel's investments accelerated in the years following 2020, a period marked not just by global pandemics and civil unrest, but by a rising awareness of systemic fragility, climate instability, digital radicalization, economic volatility. Thiel is not a man prone to sentiment. He is a futurist with a sharp, often uncomfortable clarity. And what he sees in the near future, he does not trust. His compounds include not only stockpiles of food and fuel, but skilled humans, medical experts, engineers, security personnel, and agronomists. Some reports even suggest he maintains lists of essential people, pre-cleared for evacuation. A curated society engineered for continuity. And underneath it all, a strange duality. A man who once funded bold visions of libertarian openness now prepares to live behind sealed doors. A man who helped birth the Internet as a tool of democratization now prepares for a world where that same tool may unravel everything. What do you call a world where freedom builders choose fortresses? Perhaps it is not contradiction, but evolution. Perhaps the builders of tomorrow's digital frontier now see what their creation has wrought. A world where truth is fragile, systems are brittle, and civilization can be undone with a whisper and a hashtag. In that light, Thiel's bunkers are less about fear and more about calculation. Not just survival, selection. A place not just to ride out collapse, but to reboot from it. With new rules, new code, But even the most sophisticated fortress cannot answer the oldest question: what is worth saving, and who decides? And when the last plane lands in New Zealand, when the last gate locks and the signal fades, will what's inside be humanity's hope or its ghost? It was called the Exodus Protocol. Not in a film, not in fiction, but in internal documents from Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' space company. A contingency plan, a quiet manifesto, a way out. Bezos, the man who turned online shopping into an empire and himself into the richest person on Earth, has spent more than $1 billion a year pursuing something most still call science fiction: orbital habitats, space colonies, off-world life. But behind the curtain of aerospace ambition lies something starker: preparation for escape. Blue Origin spacecraft, New Shepard and New Glenn, weren't designed for exploration alone. Their interiors prioritize life support. Their blueprints echo permanence, long-term habitation, not just joyrides, food production modules, artificial gravity, medical facilities, the infrastructure of exile. Then came the patents: massive orbital stations capable of housing thousands, plans for artificial climates, renewable agriculture, and autonomous manufacturing, all in zero gravity. More than vision, more than ego. These were blueprints for life beyond a failing Earth. Recruitment followed. Experts in space-based farming, psychological isolation, orbital construction. People trained not to discover the stars, but to survive in them. What's most haunting is how little of this made it into public view. To the world, Bezos speaks of inspiration, of pushing boundaries. But inside Blue Origin, the language changes. Risk assessments, evacuation timelines, emergency launches, pre-selected passengers, a cast for the first act of off-world survival. And those passengers? Engineers, doctors, agronomists, technologists, families, donors, the chosen few, hand-picked to seed the sky with civilization should the ground no longer hold it. It echoes older stories: the Ark, the Exodus, the longing to escape the wrath of Earth. But this time, it's not divine flood or prophecy. It's climate models, economic strain, algorithmic unrest. And those who understand it best have stopped betting on reform. Bezos' investments beyond Blue Origin mirror this trajectory. He's purchased vast tracts of farmland, controlled logistics networks, and backed bioengineering startups capable of synthetic food production. He's built data centers with hardened infrastructure designed to operate even as the world falters. He's building a self-contained reality, one foot on Earth, the other in orbit. Most unsettling of all is the growing alliance between space billionaires. Quiet agreements, shared technologies, divided territories. Bezos and Musk, competitors on paper, but collaborators in silence. Preparing for a future in which space isn't a destination, but a refuge. And so we arrive at a haunting possibility: that the most powerful men alive are constructing a civilization in the clouds, not because they believe in our future, but because they don't. If the skies above become the new promised land, what becomes of Earth? Who inherits the storms, the scarcity, the silence left behind? The Exodus Protocol is more than a plan. It is a verdict, a belief that the systems holding us together are too tangled, too broken, too late to fix. And when the rockets lift, silent through the stratosphere, carrying gardens, servers, and silence, they won't just be launching into space. They'll be leaving us behind. At the top of the world, buried beneath ice and rock, lies a vault. Its doors are thick, its air chilled to preserve what's inside for centuries. Millions of seeds, every color, shape, and strain, lie dormant, waiting. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault is often described as a backup for humanity. But Bill Gates has taken that concept and multiplied it, quietly funding a constellation of seed banks across the globe. Not for science, for survival. Gates, once the face of software innovation, has reemerged in the last decade as a farmer of last resorts, investing in farmland, agricultural science, and synthetic biology. His interests stretch from drought-resistant crops to lab-grown meat, artificial photosynthesis to decentralized medicine. And while his public messaging focuses on food security and climate resilience, the scale of these projects suggests something deeper. Contingency. His vaults are not merely museums of biodiversity. They are designed to reboot a world where nature no longer cooperates. Each facility is geologically stable, independently powered, and sealed against natural or man-made disasters. Inside, not just seeds, but instructions, protocols, recipes for rebuilding agriculture from the ground up. The deeper layer is even more revealing. Synthetic biology programs capable of producing food without soil, light, or even plants. Protein from algae, vitamins from microbes. Meat without animals. These aren't conveniences for the affluent. They're lifelines for a world where the sky no longer rains and the soil no longer yields, and Gates is preparing for that world. Beyond agriculture, his foundation has funneled resources into portable medical labs, stockpiles of vaccines, and emergency hospital systems. Decentralized, durable, designed for use in a grid-down society, a medical net for when the lights go out. Critics have called him paranoid, others prescient, but the pattern is clear. Create closed-loop systems for food, medicine, and survival, capable of operating entirely outside traditional infrastructure. More quietly, he's been buying land, not just in the Midwest, but globally, arable, water-rich, and lightly populated. Places that could anchor post-collapse recovery, places where tomorrow could be planted. Some documents even outlined recovery timelines, strategies for deploying seeds, training programs for new farmers, distribution routes not reliant on any functioning government. The question is not whether Gates believes a collapse is possible. It's whether he believes it's already underway, too slow to be called catastrophe, too fast to stop. And unlike others building walls or rockets, Gates seems focused on staying, on outlasting. But even this grounded preparation holds a certain remove. It is one thing to survive, another to decide how the future is reseeded, and by whom. In Gates's vaults lie not just the building blocks of life, but the power to choose which life returns, which grains, which medicines, which people. When control over survival becomes concentrated, does benevolence matter? Perhaps Gates's preparations are the most chilling precisely because they feel the most rational, quiet, methodical, impossible to dismiss as fantasy. And so we're left with a paradox. The man who gave the world software now prepares to restart its biology. Not in theory, in vaults, waiting. The seeds of tomorrow held not in our hands, but in his. In the heart of the Pacific, shrouded in mist and myth, lies the island of Lanai, 98% owned by one man, Larry Ellison. What began as a vision for sustainable tourism has evolved into something far more complex. Beneath the surface of this tropical paradise is a hidden city of systems, silently humming with intention. Desalination plants, solar and wind farms, backup generators fueled and fortified, an island that could survive completely on its own. And perhaps that's the point. Ellison, the billionaire founder of Oracle, did not just buy land. He bought potential sovereignty, a functioning micronation designed for permanence, for seclusion, for endurance in the face of collapse. From its fortified ports to its airstrips capable of receiving military-sized cargo planes, Lanai is not merely a retreat. It's an ark, disguised as an eco-resort. Locals tell stories about construction sites that don't appear on public permits, about tunnels deep in the hills, about facilities that seem to disappear underground. about convoys arriving under cover of darkness, carrying equipment that doesn't match any advertised project. What Ellison is building isn't speculative, it's operational, agricultural operations capable of feeding thousands. Medical centers stocked and staffed for long-term care. Communications infrastructure severed from commercial grids. Surveillance systems that track every wave, every shadow, every approach. And more than anything, people. Not tourists, not guests, residents. Recruited for their skills. Engineers, surgeons, farmers, technicians, security experts. An intentional population, quietly curated to sustain a miniature society when the larger one begins to fail. It's a strategy not of isolation, but continuity. A bet that if the mainland fractures, the island can hold. Ellison's investments speak of a mind that understands systems and their breaking points. He built his fortune modeling data structures, predicting failure modes, and designing software that survives stress. Now he's applied that same logic to the physical world, and while others dream of rockets and bunkers, he has chosen a middle path, controlled detachment, a fortress with a beach, a lifeboat with luxury. But as with all lifeboats, the question lingers, who gets a seat? When a billionaire owns an island and transforms it into a bastion of survival, where is the line between stewardship and dominion, between preparedness and secession? Lanai is no longer just real estate. It is a blueprint for governance, for independence, for a post-collapse order where borders blur and power flows to those who control resources, not just information. And in that blueprint, we glimpse a future where resilience becomes the new privilege, not the shared, communal kind, the kind that comes with gates, passwords, and airspace restrictions. Perhaps Ellison sees the same storm coming as the others, but rather than flee to the stars or dig into the earth, he's building his new world on an old volcano, surrounded by water, protected by wealth, and ready to unplug. From a distance, it looks like paradise, but up close, it feels like a farewell. There's a difference between having a safe room and having a global network of them. Reid Hoffman, co-founder of LinkedIn, has taken preparation to a different scale. Not an island, not a single bunker, but a constellation. Survival facilities spread across continents, linked by private transit routes and emergency protocols. A web of safe zones that form a quiet infrastructure for weathering catastrophe. To those who know him, Hoffman has always been a systems thinker. His wealth was built on connection, human networks, knowledge exchange, scalable design. Now, those instincts have turned inward, toward resilience. Each node in his network is discreetly located, politically stable, geographically varied, designed for different scenarios: flood, fire, famine, war. If one zone becomes untenable, another activates. A failover system, not for software, but for life. These aren't mere shelters, they're self-contained societies in miniature. Medical facilities, water treatment, power generation, secure data centers, even workshops for manufacturing vital goods from raw materials. Redundancy at every level. Isolation without stagnation. The most striking aspect isn't the technology, it's the people. Reports suggest Hoffman's bunkers are staffed by personnel drawn from his own ventures, engineers, logistics managers, communications experts, staff trained in crisis response and psychological resilience. Some facilities even include living quarters designed for families, indicating not just short-term refuge, but permanent habitation. The goal is not simply to survive, it's to continue operating, to maintain systems, businesses, influence, to bridge a broken world while others are still searching for firewood. More than any other billionaire, Hoffman's approach resembles a decentralized government, not bound by borders but by bandwidth. If the state falters, the network holds. If the grid goes dark, the mesh activates. If the markets crash, crypto reserves sustain commerce. And his vision doesn't end at survival. Through quiet partnerships with other Silicon Valley titans, Hoffman has helped coordinate mutual aid agreements between elite compounds. Shared defense, shared transport, shared resources, a private continuity plan for the digital age. It's tempting to call it paranoia, but there's precision here, the same clarity that made LinkedIn more than a job board. The sense that networks, real ones, are our last defense against entropy. Still, a question flickers at the edge of this network. Who gets to log in? Because if resilience becomes privatized, if continuity is only available to those in the right circles, then collapse won't be equal. It will be curated. Perhaps Hoffman's map of bunkers is less about fear than faith, in networks, in foresight, in planning. But it also underscores something darker, a quiet confidence that the systems outside the network won't hold. And as these compounds come online, as protocols are tested and access lists updated, the rest of the world continues unaware. Thinking perhaps that if something truly terrible were coming, surely someone would tell us. But the network doesn't broadcast. It prepares, silently, efficiently, one link at a time. In the sleek, glass-walled headquarters of Apple, everything gleams with precision. The future is coded into every curve, every seamless surface. But beneath that serenity lies something less visible, a shadow network, armed and alert. Tim Cook, Apple's CEO, is not known for theatrics. He does not tweet provocation or chase headlines. Yet quietly, he has built a private security apparatus so advanced, so militarized, that intelligence analysts have begun calling it a private army. It began as corporate protection, standard in an era of espionage and global unrest. But it evolved. Combat veterans from elite military units, cybersecurity experts trained in offensive digital warfare, armored vehicles, evacuation plans, coordinated drills involving siege scenarios and urban conflict simulations. This isn't about boardroom safety. It's about survival in the breakdown. Apple's data centers, designed to store the world's memories, now double as fortresses. Reinforced perimeters, independent energy systems, encrypted communication lines that could survive an internet collapse. If society fractures, Apple's infrastructure will not, and that includes people. Key personnel have designated safe houses, secured transportation routes, and round-the-clock protection, not just from hackers or competitors, but from the possibility of social unrest, civil collapse, or worse. Why such extreme measures? Because Cook, like others in his circle, has had access to classified briefings on infrastructure vulnerabilities, economic tipping points, and the cascading effects of digital manipulation. In his world, data isn't abstract, it's predictive, and the patterns suggest instability. More telling are Apple's investments, not just in tech, but in independence. Alternative supply chains, domestic manufacturing hubs, redundancies built to keep the machine running even as global systems seize. And in the background, quiet collaboration. Cook has coordinated Apple's emergency plans with other tech giants and government agencies, mutual support agreements, data continuity protocols, cyber defense alliances, not just for a rogue app or a regulatory threat, but for systemic collapse. To the public, Apple remains the face of simplicity, elegance, control. But inside, it has become a citadel, a company prepared to function as a sovereign entity if the nation-state falters. There's something deeply unsettling in that image. A corporation not just outpacing government, but replacing its most essential functions: security, continuity, protection. Cook doesn't speak about these things. He lets the products speak. But behind the polished glass and whispered keynotes lies a silent question. When the guardians of our digital lives prepare for real-world collapse, who are they protecting? And who are they leaving behind? Perhaps the most chilling truth is not that these preparations exist, but that they've become logical. In a world where information is power, Cook's army doesn't just guard the gates. It decides who gets through them. And when the lights flicker, when the systems strain, and the signal weakens, Apple won't just be a brand, it will be a border. In a quiet corner of the digital world, where encryption replaces infrastructure and networks float freely through the ether, Jack Dorsey is building something intangible and unbreakable. He is not constructing bunkers or buying islands. His project doesn't rise from steel or soil. It lives in code, in protocols, in networks that don't need permission to exist. While others fortify their homes, Dorsey fortifies communication. His vision, a world where no collapse, governmental, financial, or social, can silence the flow of information or money. At the center of it all is Bitcoin. For Dorsey, cryptocurrency is not just financial innovation. It is resistance. It is insurance against institutional failure, a decentralized refuge that cannot be seized or censored. His companies have poured resources into wallets, exchanges, and education, all aimed at making cryptocurrency viable when traditional systems falter. And they might. In Dorsey's view, it's not a question of if, but when. Alongside his financial revolution runs another: communication. Through decentralized social media, mesh networking, and satellite internet projects, he is designing tools for connection that cannot be switched off. Platforms without owners, messages without middlemen, truth without borders. These technologies, still nascent, carry the DNA of rebellion, but also of preservation. In a world where central authorities might crumble or control becomes absolute, Dorsey's web of decentralized tech would remain. To some, this is utopian. To others, subversive. But to Dorsey, it is the only path forward. The decentralized systems he builds are not merely escapes from government. They are escapes from dependency, from single points of failure, from silence. And he's not working alone. Quiet alliances are forming between technologists and civil liberties advocates, between developers and dissidents. Their shared goal is continuity of knowledge, of freedom, of civilization's digital core. Inside this quiet fortress of code lies another element: preservation. Internal documents from Dorsey's ventures outline protocols for data survival, distributed backups, offline recovery systems, encrypted caches of information that could survive both censorship and collapse. A digital seed bank, not unlike Gates's vaults, but for ideas, culture, truth. Because in Dorsey's world, the greatest danger is not chaos. It's forgetting. His work is less visible than bunkers or rockets. It doesn't photograph well. But it endures in circuits and satellites, in invisible pulses that leap from tower to tower. And when the grid cracks and the lights blink out and trust in institutions fades, Dorsey's systems may remain, not because they are the most powerful, but because they do not require permission to exist. His is a vision of resilience not through force or wealth, but through architecture, one where anyone, anywhere, can still speak, still trade, still know. And in a world unraveling, that may be the most radical shelter of all. Marc Benioff didn't just buy land in Hawaii. He bought something rarer: autonomy. At first glance, his holdings look like an eco-conscious billionaire's dream. Green energy projects, healthcare investments, sustainable agriculture. But beneath the palm trees and polished branding lies something more profound: a prototype for independent governance. Benioff, the founder of Salesforce, has spent years quietly transforming his Hawaiian estates into a self-contained territory, with its own utilities, security forces, educational systems, and media channels. A parallel infrastructure, built not to rebel, but to persist. The idea isn't secession in the dramatic sense. It's subtler, more systemic. A question asked through design. If the institutions we depend on falter, can we still function, govern, educate, care for, and feed without them? Benioff's territory suggests the answer is yes. His investments reach every layer of civic life: local newspapers, radio stations, internet service providers, not just to inform, but to shape narrative, to maintain coherence if national media fractures. His foundations support clinics and hospitals. His education initiatives train local talent for self-sufficiency. The architecture of a new polis built quietly in the Pacific. Water systems are decentralized. Power grids are self-sustaining. Communication infrastructure is hardened against failure. Roads and transportation hubs are upgraded for heavy logistics. There are even reports of local governance structures being modeled and tested should standard political leadership falter. And behind it all is influence, not just financial, but cultural. Benioff has built alliances with local leaders, native communities, and political figures, forming a foundation of legitimacy for this emerging microstate. If others are preparing to leave Earth or seal themselves underground, Benioff is preparing to govern, to inherit responsibility when others flee. This strategy may seem noble, but it is not without questions. Who participates in this new governance? Who sets the rules when old ones collapse? Is a billionaire's benevolence a substitute for democracy, or a quiet rehearsal for ruling in its absence? There's power in readiness, but also a shadow. When continuity becomes a private venture, who ensures it remains accountable? Benioff's island infrastructure is robust, but its implications ripple far beyond Hawaii. It suggests a world where public trust has eroded so deeply those with means no longer invest in reform, but in replacement. The island nation is not a metaphor. It is a model. And as global systems strain under the weight of climate, conflict, and misinformation, it offers a chilling possibility that the future will not be inherited by the most prepared governments, but by the most prepared individuals. Perhaps Benioff sees the writing on the wall. Perhaps he believes that the best way to preserve civilization is to recreate it on a smaller scale, on his terms. The list reads like a roll call of titans: Zuckerberg, Musk, Thiel, Bezos, Gates, Ellison, Hoffman, Cook, Dorsey, Benioff. 10 names, 10 fortresses, 10 visions of survival, each different in form, some buried beneath mountains, others orbiting the stars, some grounded in soil, others floating in signals and code. But all sharing one unspoken truth: a belief that the world as we know it is on the brink. Not just a downturn, not just disruption, collapse. Together, their preparations form a mosaic of fear and foresight, of private solutions to public failure, of confidence in technology but not in society. These aren't emergency kits or temporary retreats. They are full-spectrum infrastructures, complete with food, medicine, education, governance, and defense. Arcs built not with wood, but with wealth. What connects them is not just means, it's motive. Access to information the rest of us don't see. Predictive models, insider intelligence, AI simulations of global fragility. And the pattern they discern is clear enough for them to act, decisively, secretly, and with stunning scale. Perhaps most haunting is the timeline. Nearly every project accelerated after 2020. That year wasn't just a crisis, it was a revelation. It exposed the thinness of supply chains, the brittleness of politics, the speed at which truth can dissolve. And the billionaires took note. They began building, faster, deeper, farther. They coordinated, shared resources, formed quiet alliances. One for underground bunkers, one for Mars, one for seed banks and digital fortresses. The domains vary, but the direction is shared. Out, away, apart. Their solutions are not for everyone, Most are designed to accommodate a few hundred people at most, families, specialists, essential personnel. The rest of humanity is not part of the plan, and therein lies the deeper story. This isn't about doomsday prep. It's about divergence, a branching of futures, one path for the ultra-prepared few, another for the rest. If collapse does come, it will not be experienced equally. Some will hide, some will flee, some will inherit the silence. But even in their vast preparations, a shadow remains. Because what none of these systems guarantee, not the bunkers, not the rockets, not the networks, is meaning. What does it mean to survive if the world you emerge into is defined by isolation, scarcity, and fear? What civilization is worth restarting if it begins with exclusion? And what wisdom is preserved in a vault if it forgets the value of the village? These 10 billionaires have seen something, or believe they have. Their plans are not fantasies, they are blueprints. They exist, but so do we. And the question their actions ask, perhaps without meaning to, is simple. What will you do, knowing they have already decided to leave? The silence isn't just metaphorical, it's engineered. Behind every steel door, encrypted server, and satellite relay is a choice: to observe quietly, to prepare privately, and to disclose nothing. In their most revealing moments, these billionaires do not speak of salvation, only of systems. Systems that will endure, even if society does not. Systems that replicate the essentials of life, minus the chaos of the crowd. But survival is not the same as living, and fortresses, no matter how advanced, are not immune to loneliness. What happens in year 5 when the sealed doors stay closed and the world outside is still broken? When the soil is thin, the conversations recycled, the echoes of loss louder than any generator. No vault can store community. No seed bank can germinate trust. No satellite can replace the messy, vital noise of human connection. In some ways, these billionaires are not escaping collapse. They are rehearsing a new world, one without friction, without unpredictability, without dissent. A world curated for function, not feeling. But the human story has never been about function alone. It is about contradiction, vulnerability, the stubborn refusal to give up on one another, even in the face of ruin. That's what's missing from these preparations, the faith that we might still get it right, not through algorithms, not through isolation, but through each other. The irony is that the very technologies that made these men powerful were built on connection, on networks, on shared ideas and digital bridges. Now, those same architects are building walls. So perhaps this is not just a story about wealth or fear or even foresight. It's a story about disconnection. The moment when those with the most resources to shape the future chose, instead, to escape it. Not all at once, not with drama, but step by step, land by land, protocol by protocol. And yet, there is still time. The systems they're creating are real, but they are not inevitable. They are choices, reflections of a belief that what comes next must be survived, not shared. But belief can be changed. Futures can be rewritten. If the lesson of these preparations is that collapse is possible, then the counter-lesson must be that unity is essential. Because if we accept that only the few will survive, we will build a world that ensures it. But if we choose instead to reconnect, to listen, to repair, to resist the gravity of escape, then maybe these bunkers will remain empty. Maybe the future won't need vaults and rockets and fortified islands. Maybe it will just need us. Together, still trying, still here. In the end, it's not the bunkers that haunt us. It's the silence. The silence of 10 billionaires who have seen the edge more clearly than we have. Who ran simulations, read intelligence briefings, watched real-time fractures in the world's systems, and chose not to speak but to prepare. Their actions were not conspiracy. They were calculus. Each man placed a different bet on isolation, on orbit, on decentralization, but all arrived at the same answer, that the world as it stands is no longer trustworthy, that the best path forward is not to fix it, but to survive it. Yet, as we follow the trails of their preparations, the tunnels, the launch pads, the encrypted signals, we are left with a deeper question. What is survival, if it leaves the rest behind? What is the purpose of technology, if its final application is escape? What becomes of humanity when its most powerful minds design a future without most of us in it? These are not rhetorical questions. They are invitations. Because the story you've just heard is not set in stone. It's a mirror held up to the present, and in its reflection we see a choice. We can continue down a path of fragmentation where resilience is privatized and solidarity is replaced by sovereignty, or we can reclaim the very tools that made these men titans. Not to build walls, but bridges. We can demand systems that protect everyone, not just the select. We can design futures that value wisdom over wealth, cooperation over control. But it will take something that none of the bunkers, rockets, or seed vaults can provide. It will take trust. Not blind trust, but earned trust, grown slowly, painfully, through conversation, transparency, and shared purpose. The billionaires may have moved on. They may be watching the skies or listening through fiber optic threads in the ground. But the rest of us are still here, still building families, sharing meals, holding each other up when systems fall down, still choosing community over fear, still choosing to stay. And maybe that, not a vault in the Arctic, not a shuttle to Mars, is the real foundation for survival. Because when the dust finally settles and history asks who endured, it may not be those with the best escape plan. It may be those who never stopped believing that the future was worth staying for, even when the powerful had already left, even when the silence said otherwise. Even then, we stayed, and we remembered what they forgot, that survival is not enough. We came here to live.